Welcome to the Nam Hải. I'm Reda Amalou. I'm based in Paris at the architectural firm AW2. We designed the resort that you're visiting today. In its first year of operation, the Nam Hải won worldwide acclaim for a grand suite of magazines. The one I'm most proud of was conferred by Travel and Leisure magazine, which hailed the Nam Hải as the best resort in the world in its annual design competition. Some of you have come a very long way to visit the Nam Hải. That's why we've been moved to create a walking tour of the Nam Hải as a way to answer a few questions and open a few doors into the culture of this country. It's my belief that history and time are an especially fertile breeding ground for contemporary and future architecture. In the following tour, I'm going to focus in two distinct areas, in the villas themselves and along the main axis of the resort. I am also going to take you to an original temple structure that we've preserved on the grounds of the Nam Hải. Before we get underway, let me call your attention to the resort's emblem, the lanterns of Hoi An. If you've been to our restaurant, you've seen an interpretation of these lanterns in the exquisite glass orbs. And if you've been to Hoi An, you've seen a profusion of lanterns hung from the old town's shop houses. Hoi An is famous for its lanterns. Lanterns factor significantly into the aesthetics of Asia, and so we have adopted this motif as the emblem of the resort. And now, let us begin the tour. The entire design of this resort is rooted in the Vietnamese house. The villas at the Nam Hải are a reinterpretation of an archetype that is found in central Vietnam. To the Vietnamese, these houses are known as Nha Rong or Nha Vuon. Nha Rong literally translates as house panels or house of panels, and Nha Vuon translates as house garden or garden house. For the purposes of this introduction, let's refer to the structure as a garden house. These homes are characterized by a relationship between breadth and depth that's been preserved in our interpretation of the villas, by a pitch roof of flat tiles, by a timber frame that supports the immensity of the roof, and by panels of decorative art within. In Toi Tien Huế province alone, a French NGO has identified hundreds of these traditional homes, but they're vanishing fast, undone by time and weather and by the prerogatives of families who yearn for brighter, cleaner, open spaces for their families. Now, let me ask you to go outside the villa and stand several meters away from the side of the villa. In the garden house, the longest side of the house is typically the front facade. In nearly every case, the front of the house is characterized by a suite of doors. That's not the case in our interpretation. The front of our villa is the narrow seaside facade. In fact, we have reoriented the spatial arrangement of the traditional house by 90 degrees. If you were standing in an original garden house, you would be standing among several colonnades. Traditionally, these columns were made of go lim, also known as ironwood. The columns were necessary to support multiple layers of roof tiles. That necessity created a great deal of structural intrusion into living space. In our interpretation, we've employed modern engineering to handle the weight of the roof, but preserved some of the columns in homage to that defining element of the interior space. Now, let me draw your attention to the platform bed of the villa. After the ancestor altar, the platform bed, or fan, is the most prominent furnishing in the Vietnamese home. Far more utilitarian than beds in the West, the platform bed is multi-purpose and not nearly as sacrosanct as sleeping spaces in the West. Culturally, Vietnamese people prize community over the individual. Privacy is not nearly as hallowed, so there is no discord in a furnishing that serves as a foundation for a card game, a meal of rice and fish, some work on the maintenance of a conical hat, and sleep. At bedtime, the Vietnamese typically roll a thin straw mat onto the wooden platform, and voila, sleeping accommodation. At the Nam Hải, we abandoned the austerity of the traditional bed, but retained the multipurpose functionality of the fan and the centrality of its location in the home. On the Nam Hai's platform bed, like the Vietnamese fan, there is opportunity to sleep, to work at a desk, to lounge with family, and even, here's the novel twist, take a bath. I'd like now to return to the timber frame of the traditional house. Beneath the highest pitch of the garden house, homeowners frequently hung a dropped ceiling as a way to provide definition and decor to an otherwise vast space. We've retained the dropped ceiling above the platform bed, and we've reimagined the panels, the rong, that very distinctive decorative element, in a wooden grille that defines the lower roofline. At the entrance to most garden homes, there is no direct route from the edge of private property to the main door of the house. Instead, the bin phong, or screen, diverts the ability of anyone or anything to move directly in a straight line. I understand this impulse to screen the home in a variety of ways. First, the screen serves as a distraction to malevolent spirits carried down the wind. But I also understand the indirect route necessitated by the bin phong as emblematic of a certain indirection that's prevalent in Vietnamese culture. Unlike many in the West, the Vietnamese don't laud the straight-on direct approach. They prefer a subtle, less direct approach. How does this element of Vietnamese architecture play at the Nam Hải? If you're staying in one of the pool villas, you know already because you must walk around a bin phong whenever you approach the villa from the rear entrance. I'd like you to now proceed to the reception pavilion, where I'll lead you on a walking tour of the resort's main axis. Please press the pause button on your iPod. Let me begin this walking tour with a brief introduction to Vietnamese architecture. According to the renowned Vietnamese historian Nguyen Van Huyen, the Vietnamese understand architecture as the highest achievement of their art. But for the Vietnamese, architecture is so much more than structure. It is a melding of structure and landscape, and less easily definable constituents that the wider world know as feng shui, and the Vietnamese call phong thủy. Literally, phong thủy translates as wind-water. As we begin this part of the tour, I'd like to position you on the seaside of the reception hall, looking out over the main axis of the resort, over the reflecting pool, the upper pool, the lap pool and main pool. All the way out to sea. Let's turn now to the right, and the next stop on the tour. The long suite of doors that front the breadth of the boutique and boardroom are distinctly Vietnamese. Moving towards the sea along the right side of the axis, let me draw your attention to the roof of the open lounge to the right. The vast roofs of these more public buildings are of the second traditional style found throughout this part of Vietnam, and they are hallmarks of Hue architecture. The tiles that you find on the roofs of most traditional structures in Vietnam fall into one of two categories: pan tiles, whose interlocking S-shaped sections reference the yin and the yang, and flat tiles that achieve such density of configuration that the Vietnamese often liken the layers to the scales of a fish. Moving on, I'll ask you to stop at the uppermost swimming pool and have a look at the big-bellied jars set on their own stages. As everyone knows, rice is an integral part of Asian culture, as much part of Vietnamese culture as any other, perhaps more so. When you eat in Vietnam, you ăn com, or eat rice, even if you're not actually going to eat rice. The jars before you here are used for rice and water as well. Typically, the big jars are used for water and the smaller, same-shaped jars are used for rice. Though our jars have handles, the traditional ones do not. When the Vietnamese carry these, they embrace them. That speaks to the culture's relationships to its staple. Culturally, there's been a love affair between the Vietnamese and this crop for thousands of years. At this point, I won't ask you to continue your descent to the main pool, but do look at the ranks of palms. The symmetry is naturally appealing, but this too has precedent in the garden house, many of which are set off by a line of areca palms. The straightness of a tree trunk is an emblem to the integrity of a home's occupant, the symbol of a gentleman. Like so many elements at large in the Nam Hải, we've sought multiple levels of reference to tradition as we designed the resort. I would also point out to you the wonderful frangipani trees around the main pool. The Nguyen emperors were particularly fond of this tree. The lovely flowers tempt pickers, but mindful Vietnamese, for whom the flowering boughs of beautiful trees are often fair game, avoid picking these blooms. Why? according to a local custom, a ghost may follow that lovely flower home with you, and nobody wants that. If you cross now to the opposite side of the axis, toward the restaurant, I want to mention one other inspiration. Note the sheer-faced walls that border the steps. You may recall these walls from the epic French film about the colonial era, Indochine, when Catherine Deneuve and her adopted Vietnamese daughter are sitting in a lakeside pavilion. They are actually sitting on the grounds of Tu Duc's tomb, one of the most magisterial and inspiring works of architecture in all Vietnam. At Tu Duc's tomb, indeed through Hue's imperial city and the vestige of royal palaces in Hanoi, you'll note the width of the stairways. At the Nam Hải, that same expansively wide stairway is a hallmark of our central axis. Before we leave the main axis of the resort, let me draw your attention to another design element that's central to Vietnamese tradition. In fact, after the resort's trademark lantern, the ubiquitous candle holders rank as the most assertive decorative element. Look for these marble candle holders in the gallery of the library building and within your villas as well. If you're standing back at the reception pavilion, you've come to the conclusion of our tour along the resort's main axis. I'd like to steer you in one more direction to conclude this tour of the Nam Hải and Vietnamese culture. Walk south from reception along the pathway below the high ridge of the pool villas and turn left towards the sea on the path between the two southernmost loops of villas. About 50 meters down this path is the Tan Hoang Temple. This temple sits on its original footprint, though the temple was completely rebuilt when the villas were built. Every village in Vietnam maintains a temple for their tutelary gods. It's important to understand that this temple is not derived from Buddhist beliefs or even Confucian traditions. Fishermen who put out to sea nearby worshipped at this temple, praying to locally esteemed gods for safe passage and safe return. Though the Nam Hải now occupies this site, locals still make pilgrimages to this site at Tet and on other festival days of the lunar calendar. It's in the resort's best interest to keep this temple, says one local who now works at the resort. He says, and I quote, "The reason we keep the temple is because we want to keep the ghosts in the temple, not in the villa." This concludes this design tour of the Nam Hải. I hope you'll enjoy a rich stay for the journey.